There was a human head. There was genitalia in the bucket.
Let me stop you there. What do you mean genitalia?
What I would recognize as a penis and testicles.
Gruesome testimony pulls back the curtain in the trial of Wisconsin versus Taylor Schabusiness, the woman accused of murdering and dismembering her lover. From finding a decapitated head and penis in a bucket to catching the defendant with blood all over her hands, witnesses did not hold back any chilling details on day 2 of testimony.
Ms. Schabusiness had blood on her hands when she was arrested. So
you got blood on your hands here, on your hands. Okay, yeah, we're gonna have to.
The skin, soft tissues, and muscle had been removed from the bone so that it was largely stripped down to the bone itself.
One thing I particularly noticed was for a serrated bread knife that the sharp pointed part of the knife were virtually ground down, dulled, if you will.
Where we have complete decapitation. In other words, it's going completely through the neck and the head is separate from the remainder of the body.
With day 2 came a closer look at the defendant's arrest. Jurors were shown never-before-seen body camera video of the incident.
Hi, Taylor. How's it going? Officer Russell with the Green Bay Police Department.
25-year-old Taylor Schabusiness was arrested on February 23, 2022. Investigators in Green Bay, Wisconsin say she strangled her lover, 24-year-old Shad Therion, the day prior. After that, they say she dismembered his body and sexually assaulted his remains. Police were called in the early morning hours of February 23rd when Therion's mother discovered his severed head in a bucket in her basement.
You looked in the bucket, obviously?
I did.
Okay. Did you move the contents of the bucket?
No.
Okay. There were other items in the bucket later on that you found out about, correct?
There were.
Green Bay Police Department Detective Philip Scanlon returned to the stand for a second day, describing the chilling discovery of Therion's remains.
What other items were in the bucket?
There was remains, 2 different specific types of remains that I observed.
What kind?
There was a human head. There was genitalia in the bucket.
Let me stop you there. What do you mean genitalia?
What I would recognize as a penis and testicles.
And were they laying underneath the head?
They were visible after the head was removed, yes.
What else did you see?
I observed a black Miracle 3 kitchen blade knife that was removed. Kitchen knife. I observed a yellow pocket knife, I guess for best description, with a pocket knife with a yellow handle. There was like a head of a razor, like a shaving razor blade, a nail, Jolly Rancher, and there was a flesh material that the doctor just described as a flesh material.
Blood in the bucket as well?
There was blood in the bucket, yes.
Prosecutors also called Deputy Medical Examiner Dr. Vincent Tranquita to the stand, who described the multiple locations where Therion's remains were recovered.
Doctor, I believe you mentioned essentially in the room the 4 main containers where human remains were located. Is that consistent with your recollection?
That is correct, within that room, yes.
Okay. So we've got the bucket, the blue bag on top of the dresser, the pink and gray bag on the floor, and then the tote. Are those the 4 locations where human remains were located in the room?
That is correct. As I go through a room and evaluate the room, I'm looking for evidence of a disturbance, a struggle, or an altercation. I'm looking for signs of biological material which may tell me where a body part may be located. I'm also looking for evidence that may have contributed to the death. In other words, instruments, objects, weapons, evidence of drug paraphernalia. In this case in particular, I'm also looking for places that a body may be concealed, or that might be evidence of movement of a body from one location to another.
Tranquita noted several pieces of Therion's dismembered body were missing from the basement.
I'm trying to recover as much of the individual as possible to try to ascertain that as much evidence as can be gained has been collected.
As you were going through the room, did you note that it was possible you did not have the entire body present in that room?
Yes, I did.
Did you note specifically what was missing?
On my inventory, I believe I was missing the right thigh, specifically from about the waist to about the knee. I believe that I was missing as well I was also missing the left thigh and left leg.
Those missing body parts were later recovered in a Chrysler minivan registered to Scott Tomes, who was living with Ship Business at the time of her arrest.
Who else is in the apartment? Be straight up.
Tomes.
Tomes? Who else? Just Tomes? Is he armed?
Body camera video shows officers approach the minivan in the early morning hours of February 23rd. A crock pot box can be seen in the back seat, where some of Therion's remains would later be discovered.
Nothing. Hey.
I believe we recovered the right femur or leg bone of the thigh of the decedent. We also recovered a portion of left thigh, and we also recovered a portion of left leg from about the level of the knee to the ankle.
And Doctor, was there anything noteworthy about the parts that you recovered from the van?
When they were recovered from the van, they were placed in, I believe, a crock pot box. There was evidence of skeletal trauma, including sawing, chop injuries, start and stop injuries of the bone consistent with dismemberment.
Anything else about the amount of flesh that remained on those items that were recovered from the van?
Specifically, the right femur had been defleshed. In other words, the skin, soft tissues, and muscle had been removed from the bone so that it was largely stripped down to the bone itself.
Tranquita testified Therion's body was dismembered, with his head completely cut off and parts of his body unfleshed.
Where we have complete decapitation. In other words, it's going completely through the neck, and the head is separate from the remainder of the body. There were also a number of sharp force injuries above and below the level of decapitation, consistent with multiple cuts attempted as the person is trying to get through the neck. The back has been largely flayed and defleshed. In other words, the skin of the back has been removed. Also, the muscles of the back have been removed so that we have exposed rib cage. And I believe that this is post-mortem mutilation because there is no hemorrhage associated with these injuries. In other words, I have multiple sharp force trauma with multiple stab wounds, multiple punctures, multiple incised wounds of the skin, deep cuts within the muscles and tendons and soft tissue, deep cuts within the bone, but all of these cuts are non-hemorrhagic. In other words, there's no blood or bleeding associated with it. These are consistent with post-mortem mutilation. In other words, there's no circulation going on.
Scanlon previously described his findings at the crime scene, testifying multiple knives were recovered, some that were severely ground down.
One of the knives in the Jimmy Choo bag, it appears to be a bread knife out of the kitchen block.
Were you able to make any specific observations about that knife?
I mean, the obvious observation was the red tissue and staining on the handle and on the blade. One thing I particularly noticed was for a serrated bread knife that the sharp pointed part of the knife were virtually ground down, dulled, if you will.
Okay. So that is a knife that was serrated, is that correct?
Yes.
And what do you mean by ground down?
Being familiar with a bread knife, you know, it's a large serrated knife to cut bread, and it's the pointy ends are shallowed, more flattened, dulled.
But prior to any dismemberment, Tranquita says Therion was strangled to death.
This is a great deal of force. We're not talking about simply injuries to the superficial structures, for example, the skin. I have injuries to the very thick muscles on the sides of the neck. I have injuries to the soft tissues beneath this. I have injuries to all the soft tissues surrounding the neck. And I also have hemorrhage on the soft tissue on the anterior aspect of the cervical spine. This is hemorrhage deep through multiple layers of the neck, consistent with a great deal of force being applied and a great deal of injury. I had numerous petechial hemorrhages, or burst blood vessels, of the skin of the face, of the conjunctivae around the eyes, or the pink around the eyes. I had hemorrhages as well of the whites of the eyes, or the sclera, and I also had hemorrhages of the mucosa of the inside of the mouth. These are all consistent with sharp pressure being applied to the neck and the blood vessels of the neck, causing bursting of these blood vessels. In addition, the tongue was protuberant outside of the mouth, consistent with the tongue being driven up and outwards during the process of strangulation. When I examined the tongue itself, there was a patterned indentation on the surface of the tongue, consistent with an object being pressed hard across the tongue such that it left an indentation within the tongue.
In opening statements, prosecutors pointed to a dog collar, saying that was Shabiznes's weapon of choice in her lover's murder. Tranquita confirmed the theory.
Doctor, you mentioned that you were present on scene and had the opportunity to observe two metal dog chains that were collected by law enforcement. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And did you note any consistency between those chains that were collected and the marks that you observed on Chad Therion's body?
Yes, I did.
And what was that?
When I'm observing injuries or trying to interpret injuries, I am looking for patterns. Anything that I can use to convey to an investigator, hey, you may want to look for this at the scene. In this case, we had very organized, repeating, interrupted indentations on the surface of the tongue, very evenly spaced apart. This would not be inconsistent with the pattern of a chain and the chain links as they twist, leaving separate corner impressions on the surface of the tongue.
While Therion's remains were largely bloodless, according to Tranquita, some blood was recovered from the bucket, and a toxicology report was performed.
From the fluid that was submitted, we found cocaine. We found cocaine metabolite benzoyl ecgonine. We found methamphetamine. We found amphetamine. We found delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or the active component of marijuana. And I believe we also found nicotine, which is present in most tobacco products.
In addition, Tranquita found Therion was COVID positive at the time of his death.
At the scene, we performed the examination as I previously described. In addition, because this occurred during the time of the pandemic, we also did a nasopharyngeal swab to determine if the decedent was COVID positive, and he was.
Jurors also heard first-hand accounts from Green Bay police officers who took Shabiznes into custody after Therion's remains were first found.
She appeared to be in shock or very surprised to see us. I equate it to a deer in the headlights kind of look, or a child caught with their hand in the cookie jar. Ms. Shabiznes had blood on her hands when she was arrested, so we knew at that point that there was, she was obviously involved in the incident, in the homicide. So
body camera video shows officers discover bloody footprints just moments before Shabiznes is taken into custody.
Is this blood? Does this look like blood to you? Or am I just tripping? Bloody footprint? You see this right here? Could possibly be blood. Hey, who did that? Hi, Taylor. How's it going? Officer Russell with the Green Bay Police Department. Just make sure you ain't got nothing on you here. Taylor. Taylor, you have one more for your, wrist. Just put your hands behind your back, quick.
Anybody else in your apartment?
You got blood on your hands here, too. No, on your hands. Okay, yeah, we're gonna have to.
What apartment?
I had Officer Kenny assist me with taking photographs of what looked like smeared blood on her hands and on her clothing. I also had her remove the sweatshirt that had what appeared to be blood on it, as well as her socks and her shoes.
Mid-body camera video, Shabusiness appears to be smiling while speaking with officers.
Nobody's armed?
Nobody's armed.
You sure?
I'm sure.
Shabusiness was also caught on camera smiling in the courtroom on Tuesday after Brown County District Attorney Dave Lassay argued the merit of a graphic autopsy photo showing Therion's decapitated head. Shabusiness can be seen laughing at the judge's ruling.
This photograph, it does depict the crime victim's face, at autopsy, and the state believes the photograph, while it does depict his face, and I understand it is arguably prejudicial, it is highly relevant because it demonstrates the indicia of strangulation, which is ultimately the doctor's determination as to the cause of his death, and can describe why he believes that the strangulation occurred prior to his death, and it actually shows a small portion of the remainder of his body, which demonstrates different coloration. So it's a highly relevant photograph.
Photos can be helpful. They can, and so I understand that argument. The doctor could just simply describe everything, but the question is this going to be helpful to the jury?
Law and Crime Network also caught Shabusiness on camera appearing to point finger guns at Judge Thomas Walsh before jurors were brought into the courtroom. In the second half of day 2, jurors heard from additional first responders who spoke with Shabusiness immediately after her arrest. They also heard from expert witnesses about DNA analysis. As the trial continues, stay with Law and Crime Network for complete gavel-to-gavel coverage. Reporting for Law and Crime Network, I'm Sierra Gillespie.